2, 3. I have to wait for the camera. So I'm Marguerite Most, for those of you I haven't met before, and I'm one of the reference librarians here at the law school. And I know I speak for everyone in the library and in the law school as I say, welcome to Ember. We're just delighted to have her here. She's a Duke Law School graduate from the class of 1977 and the author of Zero Chance of Passage, the pioneering charter school story, which is her story about her work to get the first charter school passed in the state of Minnesota, the first in the nation, and that occurred in
1991.
20 years ago, over 20 years ago. The Goodson Law Library is joined by 2 student organizations in co-sponsoring this event, and I just wanted to thank David Wolf, who's sitting here in the front, and representing the Duke Education Law and Policy Society, and Potter, Shannon Potter, who is sitting right next to him, and she is the co-chapter leader of Duke Students for Educational Reform, which is an organization that's campus-wide here at Duke. Both of these organizations were very helpful in just kind of getting the word out, and the law school organization also sponsored our lunch today. So thank you to both of you. The other person I wanted to recognize was Sue Hicks, who's up there taking with a camera in her hand, snapping the snapshots. Sue was really, really helpful in all of the organization behind this, making sure that Amber had a place to stay, because it's a very busy weekend with Alumni Weekend coming up, and that we could get her in and out. Apparently she almost didn't get out because it's snowing in Minneapolis. So we're glad she got here. She's going to be speaking for the first part of the program, and then following that we'll have a chance for some questions. And if you don't have a chance to ask your question and you want to connect with her afterwards, we've got a table set up by the Gothic bookstore right outside, and she'll be there for a few minutes if you'd like to buy a book or just to chat with you about charter schools generally. So before I get Ember back up here, I wanted to tell you a couple of things. In addition to her law degree from Duke, she also has an MBA from the University of St. Thomas. She was only 29 when she joined the state legislature. She served in the Minnesota legislature from 1983 to 2000 for a very long time. And she said that she first became interested in politics while she was serving as an intern with then Senator Walter Mondale in Washington as a college student. I also read that, I've lost my notes. She used to sing with a group, and the group was called Up With People. And that one of her hobbies even today is ballroom dancing. So, Ember, we are just very, very happy to have you here, and welcome, and we're so glad. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. I truly appreciate that introduction. You hit all the high points, particularly the ballroom dance part, and Up With People, which was back in the 70s. I am just delighted. I can't tell you how much I am delighted to be here back at Duke, my alma mater. I spent my time here back in, I was a graduate of 1977, and I never ever thought I'd be invited back to actually address a class here at Duke Law School. So it really has been a wonderful opportunity. I'm grateful to Marguerite for all the wonderful help that you've given to Sue, and to Frances Presma for writing that beautiful article in the Law Magazine. Really appreciated your time and effort. I also want to acknowledge a couple of friends that have joined me today. One is my classmate, David Post. He was 1 year ahead of me in '76. He's come back to say hello. And then Terry Stoops is here Dr. Terry Stoops from the John Locke Foundation. And thank you for being here as well. Let me just ask, how many of you are students, current law students right now? All right. I know you've got exams coming up. This is a gift that you're here, so thank you. What'd you say? They're almost done? No? All right, okay. So it's a gift that you're here. For those of you who are students, I'm just going to share with you a little bit of a story. When I was here, I was not the best student in the class, let me tell you that. I was probably in the middle of the pack. I think, and David knows this well, I think the day that was my most difficult day was the day that I did not make law journal. And I really thought that my career in law was going to end for sure right then and there. And so I've had to, kind of get over that disappointment and realize that there was life after law school, and was able to actually go on to actually write a book, which was something that I never expected that I would do. I know that law school is difficult, but boy, I'll tell you, the education I got at Duke Law was something that I realize now, belatedly, I think, was so important for what I did in the legislature, to become an advocate, to become someone who could persuade and to take leadership on public policy issues. That's really what I got out of Duke Law School. And I'd be actually interested in how many of you are interested in public law as a career, some kind of public law, public service. Dave and some of the others, fantastic. So I'm hoping that my story will also inspire you to do that. I also had served many years as a corporate counsel for some companies in Minnesota, 3M, you probably heard of, Radisson Hotels, Carlson Companies. So I had both the corporate and the public service, and I think both of those were supported very, very well by the curriculum here. And my whole notion of reconnecting with Duke in the last year when I came back to the reunion, the 35th reunion, was that I saw this public law program and I said, this is great, and I really want to share some of these stories about public law and the charter school story. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, this is the 20th year of charter schools in the nation. It's the 20th year from the first opening of a charter school. When I was in the legislature, I will share with you that my most favorite story came from a charter school student. And the student was a 6th grader, and she sent me a letter and she said, Senator, I know that there is a governor and a lieutenant governor, and then there's a state auditor, and then next on down are the legislators. But please, can you tell me just as soon as possible, is there anything lower than a legislator? Well, I kind of thought it was a high calling myself, and actually I entered the legislature just 5 years after I graduated from Duke Law School into the Minnesota Senate. It was just a huge gift. I was not necessarily interested in education. That was one of the ironies of it. I went on the education committee because it was something that I had really benefited from. My district was very much focused on education. Of course, I was a supporter of good, strong education. And when I was elected to the Minnesota Senate in 1982, I was a Democrat. I still am a Democrat. And I was endorsed by the teachers' unions there. We are a union state. And the labor was very, very important in our state. And so that piece of this story is going to come back in just a few moments. As I said, 20th anniversary of chartering is now in the nation. It is now in it's now in 43 states. Over 2 million students are attending chartered schools around the nation. There are 600,000 students on waiting lists to get into chartered schools. Chartering is supported by 2/3 of the American public. That's according to a Cap and Gallup poll in 2012 September. And chartering has been supported by every presidential candidate, every major party presidential candidate, since Bill Clinton championed them back in 1991. And I ask you, what else in America today does 2/3 of the American public support? Really, I don't think that chartering would pass today, because the bottom line is that chartering came from the middle of the political spectrum. It came from outside the political spectrum, and it came about because it was a bipartisan solution. So let me give you a little bit of the history here. Think back to 1980s or so. You've got President Reagan, and his administration has issued a report called A Nation at Risk. And it said that our public education system was basically in trouble. It was outrageous that they weren't meeting the needs of the students of America. So many governors and such started to think, what can we do, what can we do? And Governor Rudy Perpich in our state, also a Democrat, had this experience when he moved down from northern Minnesota to St. Paul, he wanted his students, his kids, to go to a school in the local area. But the problem is that this school was behind the one they were in up in northern Minnesota. And yet he could not move his students out of that school to another school. So Governor Rudy Perpich was the first governor in the nation at that time, this is 1985, to propose something called public school choice. Now that means a public school student can go to any public school of their choice. Now, that was a firestorm of protest against that, and it took a long time to get it passed. But when it did pass to his vision in 1988, it opened the door to chartering. So Governor Perpich's name will never be connected to chartering, but without it, chartering would have never happened. Why? Because public school choice was about more access to choices, right? A student could go to have more access to choices. But what if there weren't more choices to access? What if all the choices were the same? The problem was open enrollment allowed students to go across the city to attend another school if they wanted to. But what about the students who didn't have the means to go across the district to attend another school? What chartering was about was finding alternatives and choices in the neighborhoods where the students lived. So it was a combination of public school choice and chartering that came about. So the first reason that it occurred was because of this very visionary governor. Now, you'll see in my book, and there's a picture in there, I look about 2. I was about, honestly, but I was 29 or 30. The governor and I had a good relationship because we were both Croatian. That's how we connected, okay? There's not, there's a group of Croatians up in Minnesota. In any event, he was very supportive and he urged me on in some of these aspects. The second reason that chartering came to be might surprise you. The first time I ever heard the words chartered school or charter school came from an unlikely source. Came from the president of the American Federation of Teachers, the largest teachers union in the country. His name is Al Shanker. I attended an education reform conference and he said he was proposing chartered schools to empower teachers so that teachers could do what they were trained to do and do it well with the autonomy that they deserve. He wanted to professionalize the teaching profession. I thought that was a darn good idea. I was a Democrat, I was endorsed by the teachers unions, and I wanted to have that too. So part of what my inspiration for all this was to empower teachers, which is so ironic because the unions were the biggest opponents to it later on. But that was the second place it started. The third place it started was outside of the political spectrum. Outside. So here's an issue that all of you as public servants and lawyers can really think about. You know what? Good ideas come from the outside. And when you have an idea like this, it was important that it came from a committee called the Citizens League of people who were leaders in the community, business people, union leaders, educators, people who only cared about improving public education. No political agenda. I travel the country and I talk in various states, and you wouldn't believe all the myths that come up. Some people think chartering came from the far right. Some people think it came from the far left. It actually didn't come from anywhere but the outside and the middle. And the only way it passed was by having a bipartisan coalition. Something else that people don't realize, particularly in many states where it has become somewhat partisan, is that it was championed by Democrats. It was championed by Democrats in the Minnesota legislature and by Bill Clinton, and passed by bipartisan collaboration. Now, it was not an easy journey. There was a whole lot of resistance to it. Let me just, before I go on to that, I'm just going to say, so what is chartering for those of you who may not know? And let me just ask right now, how many of you have ever attended a charter school? Are any charter school students in here? Okay, because North Carolina, okay, well, Francis, well, all right. Has anybody had a relative or know somebody that's attended a charter school? All right, excellent. North Carolina has 107 charter schools, and your law began in 1996, only 5 years after Minnesota's law. So what is chartering and why exactly was it provided? We wanted more choices, we talked about that, but it was also a bigger issue. When Al Shanker spoke to us, he talked about how the districts could take the customers for granted. There was no place for them to go. And so unless there was something else out there to cause the K-12 districts to respond, there was no incentive to change. And so chartering, coming from the Citizens League, was about that notion of causing the K-12 system to be more responsive. More responsive. So not only to provide the opportunities and choices for more individuals and children, that maybe 5% of today's public school students attend charter schools, but also to impact the existing system and cause it to be more responsive for change. And that is occurring throughout the country. And so that was the reason for chartering, was really to have more options and more choices and to cause them to change. And that did. Once you had a charter school across the street, the district had to respond. Now, the resistance to passing this was huge. Those of you who are interested in public service, I'll share that story in more detail. It's in the book, but I'll tell you, it was not Civics 101 at all. Just picture this political paradigm. You have something very, very strongly opposed by the teachers' unions, very powerful lobby in Minnesota, particularly with Democratic lawmakers. You have majorities in the House and Senate filled with Democratic lawmakers. You have a Republican governor just elected. Why? Because he defeated Governor Rudy Perpich because he was an advocate of open enrollment. In other words, the unions went against Governor Rudy Perpich about open enrollment, supported the Republican governor. And so you had a Republican governor endorsed by the union who then appointed for his commissioner of education the chief lobbyist for the union. This is what charter schools pass through. Now, I think that in itself creates a whole different paradigm for people to understand that this really did come from the middle. And how did it come from the middle? Very interesting. In the end, it was one of those situations where you had to bring parties together. And you had to bring them together in a way where the majority party had to let the minority actually have the majority. You know what I mean? 42% of the Democratic majority voted for chartering. 56% of the Republican minority voted for chartering. So you actually had the minority carrying it. But the most important thing was you had a pro-education reform Democratic Speaker of the House. And one of the most interesting pieces, I think, that I found when I was interviewing people on this was the fact that the Speaker of the House, nobody knew his stand on this. But when the vote came up after 3 long years and incredible opposition and gymnastics, let's just put it that way, when it came up on the vote, this was a critical vote, passed by 3 votes. The Speaker of the House was in charge of the roll call. You know, the votes up on the roll call, all right? No one knows the total of the roll, all right, except the Speaker. All you see are little red and green lights, but you don't see the numbers. And the Speaker of the House, who was a pro-education reform person, closed the roll when it was 3 votes ahead. 10 people had not voted yet. So the power of the Speaker is actually what helped make this pass. Once it passed, it was just, it somehow just tipped the conversation that was already going on in the nation. A conversation that was already very vibrant because of the nation at risk. There was discussion about private school vouchers on the one hand. There was discussion about the status quo. The House Democrats in Congress were really just worried about the status quo. President George H.W. Bush was proposing private school vouchers. What happened is that chartering went right down the middle. Right down the middle. It was centrist. And that is what has sustained it for 20 years today. Now, there are a couple other reasons why it passed. Not only that it was bipartisan, but this gets to some of my own personal story here. It passed because despite the fact that my union friends were now against it, and this is really painful, I need to tell you this. These were my friends. They endorsed me. They door-knocked for me. You need to know that the lobbyist for the teachers union was my 9th grade civics teacher. This is how close it was. I mean, this was hard. And we had to, I was really thinking we could come to terms because it was about empowering teachers, but they were afraid. They were afraid of it for lots of different reasons. And so we had to break ranks. That was really tough for me. I did suffer some backlash from that later on. Later on, I ran for Congress in 2006. And some negative publicity went out by the unions on me many, many years later, 15 years later. So I know that had an impact on the congressional campaign. I did not win. It was not the only issue. But I'm just saying there are those risks when you take a stand like that. It was personally very difficult for me. And when I was done with the session, I really wondered if I had done the right thing. It was hard. And I can tell you that within a couple of weeks, when I saw President Clinton, or then Governor Clinton, and Republican Senator David Dernberger taking this to the national forum, I knew it was right, that we had to take a stand for change. And my hope today is that there is a message for you about take a stand for change. You are public servants. You are going to be trained well. And it's up to us to take that stand for change. And I hope that my book and my story is one that gets you to want to do that in education or in whatever it is that you are passionate about. So bottom line is that that was one of the things that I learned, is that, you know, sometimes you look at, you have to celebrate the small victories. And let me talk about that a little bit. And that is this. The bill that passed in chartering was only a little bit of what I ever wanted to pass. In my view, it was totally compromised. It was compromised way too much, so that I felt that there would never ever be a charter school that would ever open, and that it would never be successful. Okay, I did not want to compromise this bill. I'd worked on it 3 years. You need to understand, I'm young. I'm 30-some years old. I'm a little bullheaded. It's like, I want it all. And I'd made a couple of compromises with my teacher friends because I really needed their support. I figured I couldn't pass it without them. I made compromises. I thought I had gone far enough, but it wasn't enough. And finally, you get to the conference committee where it finally was put together. It never went through the House of Representatives. It came back through a conference committee bill. Bottom line is, they compromised this to such a place that I thought it would never, ever work. I was devastated, personally devastated, after 3 years of work. I felt I had failed. I really did. And I remember the night on the conference committee when that amendment was adopted with my friends. I thought we had all the votes, and I couldn't hold back the tears. I just had to leave. What I learned later, when I did this book and I interviewed people that had been there 15, 20 years before, is that had we not compromised the bill, it would not have passed. One of the things that my colleague and I, he's a good friend today, Democratic colleague who was chair of the Education Committee, he came to me with the compromise and he said, Ember, this is it. You got to take it. It's now or never. The resistance is too great. And he said, Ember, just remember, this guy comes from northern Minnesota, right? He said, just remember, pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. Take the compromise. Whew. I did, but I wasn't happy. And so here I felt like I'd gone through the 3 years, lost my best friends in the union, and had a very weak bill that wasn't going to do anything. Until 2 weeks later, when then Governor Clinton, the chair of the Democratic Leadership Council, where I kind of fit politically, sent a letter congratulating all of us on the bipartisan passage of charter schools. Whoa, where did that come from? I had no idea that Governor Clinton had been traveling the country for 9 months talking about chartered schools because of the paper that the Citizens League had written. I didn't know that until I wrote this book. Nobody did. So the Democratic Leadership Council had actually had a conference a month before the bill passed supporting chartering. Holy cow. I don't think that would have helped me in Minnesota because that was considered too moderate. But the bottom line is this was bubbling up. And then our Republican U.S. Senator David Dernberger was working on the other side and saying to the Bush administration, vouchers aren't ready, but this can work. Republicans, come on board. And so that's how it went through so quickly. And within a few months, I knew that we had hit a nerve, something I didn't expect. A lot of times people ask, did you know that? No, I had no idea. I was just trying to get more choices for Minnesota kids. So bottom line is, you too can take a stand for change. You too can do this. But it's not easy. There are risks, but it's really worth it. And I really hope that each and every one of you will consider a career in public service or in legislating. There's no more rewarding a career, really. There really isn't. And so with that, I'm just going to stop now and just see what questions you have and enter into conversation so we have plenty of time for that. And I really appreciate your very kind attention today. So please, let's open it up. Marguerite? Should I take the questions, or did you want to do it?
You go
All right, go ahead. Some questions? Yes, sir.
So I taught for 3 years before going to law school. I taught in traditional public school for 2 years and decided that I wanted to have, I heard so much about charter schools. So charter schools are the way of the future. Charter schools will do all these amazing things. So I wanted to work in a charter school to actually have that hands-on experience. There were some things that I thought were functionally amazing about charter schools. Because the bureaucracy is cut out. The principal has a great idea on Sunday. He can work with teachers to implement it on Friday. He can work with teachers to implement it on Monday. So you have that flexibility and the freedom to actually make important changes. One thing that I definitely didn't see on the public school side of things is this idea that the charter schools will force traditional public schools to be responsive to changes. And I was wondering if that is something that, because you mentioned that it was happening. It was very difficult to see on the ground, and I haven't really seen it in literature and or talking to other people about it. Like, at least the popular narrative for the traditional public schools is they're taking away our money. We are unable to actually perform and do these amazing things that they're able to do because, you know, they're getting, in terms of like the KIPP schools and other things like that, they're getting money that's coming in from outside places. So is that responsiveness something that was more aspirational toward the beginning and it just hasn't panned out, or is it panning out and it's just in a subtext that's not in the popular narrative?
It is definitely panning out. Let me just repeat three different aspects of your question. I'll start with the first one. The first one is, what about the concern that is raised by the district schools that the money is then funneled off to charter students versus district students? Response to that, very simple, is that money follows a student, right? Every student gets a certain amount of money to be educated, and they're getting the money to be educated. The difference is the autonomy and the opportunity to do it in a little different way outside of the confines of the district. And so there simply is not any credence to that. They get the money. It's just that the district doesn't get control of the money to put in their favorite programs, but the student who's served by it gets control, or more autonomous control. So that's number one. Number two question, and a little bit more complicated question. Well, first of all, you talked about the impact on the larger districts and such. It really has had an impact, because here's the thing. 5% of the students in the country are charter school students. 100% of the students in those states have a choice. That's really what's going on there. They have a choice, at least if there's enough charter schools. And that's what the problem in some states is, that there's 600,000 students on waiting lists, okay? So we need to have more robust quality charter schools. But what has been, and I'll give you a story. In Minnesota, there were a group of parents in a city called Forest Lake. And Forest Lake the parents wanted a Montessori alternative for their school. The administration had every reason why it wasn't possible. Didn't have the money for the transportation, for the training of the teachers, for the equipment, et cetera, et cetera. They came in with a charter school proposal after the law passed, and lo and behold, all of a sudden the superintendent responded and said, I think we can find the money. We'll do it as an in-district alternative. And they did. Well, it's not a charter school, but it's still a wonderful, responsive action for those parents, right? And so that's a real example. That happens in a lot of cases. Third area I want to talk about that you raised is a really important one. So often people compare charter schools and district public schools. The first thing I want to just say, charter schools are public schools. A lot of people don't realize it. They are, okay? So a lot of people, the media, will want to say, charter schools aren't as successful as district schools, and they'll compare them. Okay. A couple of things there. First of all, in my view, chartering, and when you go back to the origins, is a verb. It is the process of awarding a charter to a school to deliver public education. It is the process of someone other than the school district delivering public education. That is what opens up the system, okay? So it's that process. It's not a school. A Montessori alternative can be delivered in either a charter or district school. So to compare the scores in charter schools and district schools is crazy, because they're all public school students and they're all getting, they're all getting very kinds of strategies, if you will, for learning. What has been successful has been the ability to continue to generate innovative and new ideas. Now, let's just go to the elephant in the room. Not all charter schools are doing so well. I get that. And so what we need with chartering is accountability, and that's a premise in the law. That is one of the things that's so important in the charter school law, because if a charter school doesn't perform to the outcomes they've agreed to, basically you've traded regulation for outcomes, right? You're going to say, we're going to have the flexibility to do this, and then we're going to deliver on these performance objectives. If they don't deliver, they can be closed. Some states aren't closing them. They should. Some schools that are not adequate should be closed, and they're not. And I'm out here saying they should be, because that's for the good of the movement. But bottom line is, in the district schools, they don't close for those reasons. They might close for budget. But they don't close because they haven't met their objectives, right? So that's the difference in the charter concept. It's about giving the independence and autonomy to a group of parents and teachers in return for committing to deliver results. That's the basic concept of chartering. And the beautiful thing for those of you who are in public law and want to do redesign, I love redesign of services. We took that same principle in my life now as a nonprofit executive, and we used it to redesign services for human services, for people with disabilities, saying to the Department of Human Services, say, give us, Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota, the ability to take the money for these clients we serve here and give you the outcomes in return. Give us the flexibility to use the dollars to serve these clients. They know best what they need. We're over-serving some clients, underserving others. Let us work that out. We know best how to do that. We work with the clients. And in return, we give you these outcomes. You can do it in other human services. You can do it in other areas. And in the back of the book, I have a whole chapter on how chartering really is the basis of redesign in many fundamental ways in other areas. All right. Yes, please. Shannon.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on some of the hesitations that the teachers' unions had when you were first trying to pass the law?
I think you mentioned one is they really saw it as taking away money from their schools. And one of the most important things to me in this book was my interviews with the teachers union 20 years later. I'm so glad you mentioned this. They were really concerned about that it would take away from the students in the schools. It would take away from the staffing. That would be reduced staffing, obviously. And their biggest concern, not so much known about, or not so relevant in North Carolina, it took away collective bargaining union rights. They called me a union buster. I'm endorsed by the unions. By the way, I wasn't endorsed by the unions for the election after that, but they called me a union buster. In Minnesota, that is political suicide if you're a Democrat. So this was the collective bargaining was they said basically if you put the charter school in the school district under the district contract, it's fine. But that doesn't give them the autonomy to hire and fire and all the things in the curriculum that they need to do. So I was going to say that I interviewed these two leaders who were then most against it. And I can tell you 20 years later that I realized these leaders were actually really reformers, and that they wanted to see, they could see the nub of chartering. Al Shanker was the one who proposed it. They could see the autonomy for teachers, but they were so fearful about these things that they just had to oppose it. And one of the teachers wrote in the back of my book her thoughts about chartering 20 years later. And I am here to tell you that the teachers are really coming around in Minnesota on this. And last year, the same people who opposed this bitterly 20 years ago proposed the first charter school authorizer that was union initiated. So the teachers' unions proposed an authorizer so they could then have the opportunity to authorize charter schools with teacher strategies that they particularly liked, okay? And that was the first in the country. So they're coming around. And she wrote in the back of the book that she got so frustrated that the administration did not do all these innovative things they wanted to do that they finally went to the charter alternative. So it takes time, but it comes around. These two people, by the way, are my good friends today. And I write about that is that, you know, one of the things I learned is that, you know, you can agree to disagree, but that doesn't mean that you know, your friendship goes away or anything like that. And one of them was my, believe it or not, one of my strongest supporters when I ran for Congress in that congressional election where this had become an issue. So thank you for that, because I really am wanting to see what we can do to empower teachers and get them more involved in this. Bottom line, what I'd like to do is try to see what's working in district schools and charter schools and work on that and collaborate and figure out how we can make what's working work better, and when it's not working, eliminate it. Yeah, you sir.
So you had said to Chris's question before about how the keeping charter schools sort of accountable and closing the ones that aren't working, and some places aren't doing that. Do you have any sense why? Because I grew up in Florida, and a lot of Florida districts are not holding their charter schools accountable. Do you have any sense of like what the difference is between areas that are and aren't?
Well, I think that one of the lessons I did learn is when the law went through in the beginning, I didn't, and nor did the supporters, pay enough attention to this authorizer sponsor thing. In other words, the person, the group that was going to oversee them, and there wasn't any attention paid to what they were going to do or how they were going to be trained, or maybe they'd need a little money to do that. And that came about over the years, and that's been strengthened. You now have authorizer organizations around the country called National Association for Charter School Authorizers that really has been putting best practices into that. So I really think the strengthening of the authorizers. The other thing that I talk about is, maybe that's because we're lawyers, is the governance practices. And many of them, the board members aren't strong enough. They don't have that external experience to really hold the school accountable. So all of those things are being improved with trainings around the country, you know, that sort of thing. You did have another one, Chris. Go ahead.
Yeah, kind of got a couple that are, sorry for the multiple questions.
No, that's okay.
So one question, at least with North Carolina, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of communication. So charter schools, you maybe have the flexibility to test out these new innovative ideas that can then be transferred over to the, so I say charter public versus traditional.
Yeah.
But to the traditional public schools. But that flow of information doesn't really seem to be happening. And I was wondering if you could speak to any ideas that you had or any movements that there are to sort of facilitate this flow of information between schools. And I'll hold on a second.
So the flow of information isn't really happening between charters and district public schools. That's happening all over the country. For some reason, it's us against them. One of the reasons I do this work right now, and I go out around the country one time a month, is because I'm really trying to focus on what is working here and to establish that communication. I can tell you that in Minneapolis, the district schools in Minneapolis are working with some of our best performing charters to learn from each other, and they're going to together do some more schools. So I can tell you it is working, and it should, and there are examples like that.
In Minnesota, do the districts grant the charters or does the state?
That is a terrific question. There are two areas in the North Carolina law that are really relatively weak compared to other laws. And one is that it has to do with the authorizers. In North Carolina, you have basically one authorizer. And John, I'm going to look to you to correct anything I'm saying here, because this obviously isn't my home base. But my understanding is that they have one authorizer here. That's the State Board of Education with a little advisory committee that works with them. In Minnesota, you have multiple authorizers, Okay, so in Minnesota, authorizers can be the university, it can be higher education institutions, it can be nonprofits of $3 million or more. Some of the biggest nonprofits, Volunteers of America, has 28 chartered schools in Minnesota. Okay, so when you have multiple authorizers, you're not just bound by the whims of one authorizer. What happened in Minnesota when this passed, by the way, remember when I talked about how it was passed in that real compromise form and I thought nothing would ever happen? I was right for about a couple of years. Because what happened was the first 7 out of 9 charter school applicants were rejected because the only authorizer was allowed was the local school district. Well, what incentive did they have, right? Okay, only one authorizer, the local school district, who are seeing it as a competitor. So 7 of 9 of the applications are rejected. The only 2 who went through was one called City Academy for students who had actually not finished high school, they dropped out. Okay, well, that's not too competitive, is it? And the second was for a group of students who had deaf and hearing impairments. Okay, those are the only 2 that went through. Well, that made our case to go back to the legislature 2 years later and say, you gotta have another authorizer. And so they then had the state board appeal and it went from there. And then over the years, they multiplied the authorizers. The North Carolina law is very, very weak in this area. And that's one of the reasons, that's one thing that can hold back robust chartering. Second area that it's very weak in, I was telling Marguerite, I was at a press conference this morning in Raleigh about chartering as well. And they had a couple of the families talking about how their applications were rejected because of ministerial things. They didn't include this piece of paper in the hard copy, but it was in the online copy, this sort of thing, but nothing about the substance of the application. And so what's weak in the law is it doesn't lay out, here are your criteria that you need to follow, okay? And that's really important, so that you have the same criteria, you can't have them moved around by the politics. Yeah. Yeah.
In my home state, which is Tennessee, we have the districts are the authorizers with an appeal right to the state. So one of the problems I've seen as far as accountability goes is the districts that, and whatever they do, the state's a lot more conservative than the districts. Like Nashville and Memphis are obviously going to be way more liberal than the state itself in Tennessee. So if the districts don't want to authorize a charter school or want to shut down a charter school, the state's just going to overturn the decision anyway. And sometimes even take money from the districts for not following their instructions. So kind of what I've seen is the districts have no ability to actually hold them accountable, and the state doesn't actually look into the charter schools much. They just are really for the idea, so they're going to overturn the district regardless. How, in that kind of setup, how would you really hold accountability? Is that just bad law, or?
It's a little bit hard for me to respond to that one. I think there's a couple of things going on there, but the bottom line is you want to have clear processes for the what criteria need to be met. You want to have multiple authorizers so that if there are things going on that you can go to another authorizer. It is hard if your state is it the state that's holding it back? Is that what you're saying? I'm just trying to follow that.
Like the districts are the initial authorizers
Mm-hmm.
in Tennessee, but any decision the districts make can be appealed to the state
Right.
Board of Education. So if the charter school doesn't like the district's decision, they can just appeal to the state.
Right.
And the state will always side with the charter school, so the districts have no actual power.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So then what about the power of the district?
So but the problem is the districts are the ones that are actually monitoring the charter schools and seeing if they're successful. So if the state's just gonna not listen to them anyway, it's kind of hard to see how the charter schools can be held accountable in that situation.
Well, they have to be held accountable by their authorizer, whoever it is. Okay. So if you're saying that the district is being forced to authorize something that they didn't want to authorize, is that what I'm hearing you say?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But yeah, you're right, it raises that, the whole accountability. Bottom line is they need to be held accountable by someone. There's a gap in that law structure right there. Yeah, there really
well,
is.
I
Yeah.
think it's just political opposites between the district and state.
Yeah.
But when when Nashville, for example, decided not to authorize a charter school that the state wanted to authorize, they fined the district $3.5 million. So that kind of ends up being hard.
You know, you have these issues in each and every state. But I think what sometimes gets lost in the weeds, I was in Georgia just in October, they had a referendum on chartering. then the public discourse of this is that's just the, that if you get into the weeds on it, it gets really complicated. But the bottom line is, this is about choices. It's about more choices for families and kids. It's about whether we're giving kids what they need. And if the school is delivering something that is where the student can be successful. We kind of forget sometimes who in the end we're doing this for. And that to me is what keeps driving me to do this, because I really believe, and I see this everywhere that I go, that more and more students are wanting these choices. Sometimes they're held back by the politics of it. They're held back by facilities as well. They don't get sometimes the equal funding for facilities. And they don't get sometimes the equal funding in the operating revenue either. So they are doing more with less in that regard. So let me just see how I'm doing on time, Marguerite. We're still okay?
5 minutes or so?
Another 5 minutes, all right. So are there any last questions here that I've just really, David, did you have one? Okay.
8 or 10, but
8 or 10, okay. One.
if you look at it globally, since you have traveled the country, how, when you trade regulation for performance, how charter schools, these 5% of our public schools that are now charter schools, how are they performing relative to the public schools?
Well,
And how do you measure it, I suppose?
it goes a little bit to my earlier point about the fact that that you can find a study that shows any outcome you want as to comparing charters and districts, because they're really not they're not comparing apples to apples. So they're really, chartering is that process. It's that process of providing a charter, and so it's not really a valid question when you come back to the origins of chartering. So the bottom line is, yes, in some states there are some that are doing very, very well. There are some that aren't doing well. My point is the ones not doing well should be closed. What I have found also is that in Minnesota and in many states there have been a number of special needs populations that are actually doing quite well in charters. And the communities of color have been very supportive in a number of states, because this is a place where a lot of the schools are succeeding. In Minnesota, the NAACP was one of the biggest supporters of chartering at the beginning, and has been since. So the communities of color have been always there, even when no one else seemed to be there. They were there for the choices for that. But really, how they're doing, again, each state very different. But overall, there have been some very, very fine successes, and the innovations continue.
Do you have some sense of, having written this book and doing all this national research, of where you would like to see charter schools be? Do you believe that the entire public school system should be replaced? I mean, since it's a public school, should the entire public school system, which is under incredible attack, left, right, middle, parents, the higher education system, international, I mean, other countries, where our schools rank 48th out of, I mean, do you have a sense that the entire public school system should be replaced by a national charter system, so that since the money follows the child, do you think we would have a better national?
No. Should we, have a sort of the public school system become all charters or replaced by that? No, I don't, because I'm really about choices. I really want the choices. Now, in certain states and in cities, I don't know if are any of you from Washington, D.C. by any chance? You are, kind of, okay. 42% of the public school students are in charter public schools in Washington, D.C.
In the city.
Yep, in the district. In New Orleans, 80% of the public school students post-Hurricane Katrina are in charter schools. Now, that's pretty interesting. So in certain areas, 20 urban communities have more than 20% of their charter school students, their public school students in charters. So New Orleans is about the closest you have to a charter district. But I'm about the choices, and so I want to make sure that people have that choice. The problem is, in some places, they can't get the charter schools passed. They don't get the choices. That's what was happening this morning. One of the women came up with her children and said, we had this proposal. It was vetted by all these folks. It didn't get passed because there was some missing paper, and there's no charter school in her area, and they want one very badly. And so it's really about the choice in the neighborhood, and very much local. That's really what was behind that. Yes, sir?
I'm just curious as to how common it is for charter schools to have funding other than from public sources?
That's a really good question. Funding from other public sources. Sometimes there are outside sources that will support a charter school in particular. Let's say that they're technology based, or there's some other thing that that they want to support. That does occur. I'm sure foundations do that in various states. They support charter schools, but unfortunately, it's partially because the chartered schools are receiving basically less revenue than the other schools, because most of them don't get the property tax portion of that. That's the way the law is written. But the states are very different on that. They all have funding differences. But yes, we have seen some investment. Gates Foundation did a lot of investment. Walton did a lot of investment in certain charter schools. Well, I just want to close by just saying this. We got into some of the details in chartering. Whether or not it's chartering that's your passion, whatever it is, if you want to change the world in environment, if you want to change the world for people with disabilities, if you want to change the world in finding new ways for delivering financial alternatives and job creation, whatever it might be, I hope you go for it. I really hope you do that. You heard in our introduction that I was an intern for Senator Walter Mondale. Take advantage of those opportunities. I was a secretary on a campaign, on the governor's campaign in 1974. 1975, I was a law clerk in his office. It was my first year here. I went back, did the summer law clerk. And I'm telling you, it just changes your life. You get hit by the political bug, you just want to make a difference. There is no profession where you can make more of a difference than as a policymaker or as someone working in policy. And remember, you don't have to be in elected office. If that's not your thing, then look at the staff opportunities, look at creating the ideas outside the political system. Work with foundations like the John Locke Foundation and create policy ideas that you can take over to the legislature. Remember, that's how chartering started. You can make an impact. That's why I'm here today. That's why I'm so pleased, because I hope to inspire you and others to take that initiative. We need you out there. We need creative, innovative thinkers. It's not working right now in politics. We're pointing fingers at each other. Chartering wouldn't even pass today because it would be too much somebody else's idea. We need people who are there because of the policy, because it's going to have a better outcome. We're going to serve the kids. We're going to meet the needs of the public. That's you. And I really appreciate your time today, for you to even take this time. If you want to get the book, it's out there. I think you'll find it a story that hopefully will inspire you. I think I said that last, I don't think I said here, I said earlier today about the title of the book, Zero Chance of Passage. Okay, so I'll close with that story, because hopefully it gives you just something to think about. The title of the book, Zero Chance of Passage, came from the interviews that we did 2 years ago. And we interviewed my House sponsor, Democrat, who was the woman who I gave the bill to take it through the House, and we knew the unions were tough there. And so when she was interviewed 20 years later, well, what did you think when Ember gave you the bill? She responded, I had zero confidence it would pass. This was my House champion, okay? You can overcome the barriers. Sometimes it takes a little persistence. Sometimes you have to take some risks. Sometimes you have to take a few bruises. I did, believe me. But I'm telling you, today, 20 years later, it's probably the most important thing I've ever done. And I say that because I don't have kids. And for me, it's my legacy. So go out and find yours. Thanks.